So, Peter, you've just written about British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and his newly announced plan to bring back his country's national service scheme. This is pretty bold. So, what exactly has Rishi Sunak proposed?
Well, he's proposed that if the Tories are re-elected, and that's a pretty big caveat we can come back to if you want, but if the Tories are re-elected after a mere 14 years in office, then a priority will be introducing a national service scheme for all 18-year-olds in Britain. It would be compulsory. It would not have criminal penalties attached. In fact, they haven't detailed what penalties there would be if it's going to be compulsory. Presumably there's some sort of sanction. It would require only about 1 in 10 to have some military training. The other 90% would be allocated to civilian or civil functions or community welfare works. There is no detail attached really beyond what I've said and an approximation of what it might cost. But they've run through some examples of what that kind of service might be for 18-year-olds who aren't in the military. So there's a year-long military training program for about a tenth of them. The others would be expected to do things like working with emergency responders, the fire brigade, maybe working with the National Health Service to help with nursing, caring, and other community-based functions. The cost Rishi Sunak has put at about £2.5 billion, starting in a couple of years. But most of that money he's taken from another fund, which notionally has been allocated to pay for infrastructure works in the north of England, which is a much poorer section of England. And so the people of the north haven't really exactly welcomed that with great exuberance. So it's created another problem for him in the north. But that's the program so far as we know it.
Okay, so I want to get into how this has been received. But first I want to ask you, what are the youth of the nation, the people who would actually have to participate in this compulsory service, what do they think of the idea?
The initial response from what we've seen, Samantha, would be to say that they're not excited. There was a YouGov poll that gave it about a 10% approval among the people who would be closest to having to serve it. That's voters 18 to 24. So not exactly enthusiastic. So it's safe to say, I think, that Rishi Sunak would have known that, and his party would have known that. The party headquarters would have known that. They would have done some test focus groups at the very least. So it's fair to say that he's not pitching for the youth vote with this idea.
So tell me about this, because you have written, of course, that the idea is actually popular with older conservative voters. Presumably this has been a very concerted effort for him to appeal to them. So tell me about this.
Well, the politics of it, the political logic behind this, and mind you, the relevant minister in Rishi Sunak's Conservative government rejected this idea in parliamentary questions just 2 days before Sunak called the election, just 2 days. So it wasn't exactly a carefully developed piece of government policy. This was really on the fly out of either the campaign HQ or the Prime Minister's office. But the political logic, even if there is no actual underlying policy work to support it in the British government, is that the Tories are losing, and losing badly in the election that Sunak has called. On the average of all the polls so far, the Labour Party, the opposition, is polling about 44%, and the Tories are polling a dismal 23%, absolutely dismal. Now, they're going to lose the election, but Sunak's trying to salvage what he can. I think this particular proposal is designed not to attract people from the left or from the youth vote. This is designed to shore up his right flank, conservative, long-standing Tory voters who've been drifting, and he has been losing votes on his right to the Reform UK Party, which is the latest sort of populist right-wing iteration on the British political spectrum. So I think that's what this is designed to do, to support the base, to rally the base, protect as much of the Tory vote as possible going into what they clearly appreciate is going to be a loss.
And can you give us some context here? Because I've seen some commentary recently about Rishi Sunak's popularity and how the Tories are faring, and it's been scathing. I mean, I've seen Sunak described as a dead man walking, and one commentator wrote that the Conservatives are facing a kind of extinction-level event. So just how bad are things for the Tories, and where are they bleeding votes to?
Well, they're bleeding votes left and right, but mostly to the left, which is, where the election's obviously going to be decided, and Labor's in a commanding position. Yes, well, after 14 years and multiple misfires on every conceivable level, they are facing a serious wipeout, which is why on the last time I looked, nearly 80 Conservative members of Parliament have rushed out to say, as soon as Sunak announced the election, they rushed out to say, well, we're not recontesting. We're going to retire from Parliament and let someone else contest my seat, and they can lose instead of me.
Wow. That's amazing. And also, I guess back to this particular policy, this very bold policy that Sunak has just announced, it also, I think, went down badly within his party once it was announced. I know that one of his own ministers, Steve Baker, said upon its announcement that actually this was sprung on the ministers and it hadn't been agreed to beforehand. So perhaps has this policy in itself created even further animosity or division within the party, which I imagine is the very last thing it needed?
Well, I think the minister who denied that there was any such concept just 2 days before Sunak's announcement was actually the relevant minister. He was the Minister for Military Personnel.
Right.
And he went through the reasons to Parliament about why this was a dumb idea. He said it would cost too much, it would distract the professional military because they'd have to be busy training the national service guys. And it's just a bad idea. And we have no such plan. And then 2 days later, his Prime Minister announces the plan. And if they've been in office 14 years, if this is such a great idea, why didn't they already do it? I mean, these are the obvious things. So this is why the Labor Party has called it, quote, a desperate gimmick. And it is. It's a political tactic to shore up the right of the party in a pretty dismal-looking election. It doesn't mean that the idea itself is necessarily a dreadful one, and we can talk about that if you like, but you're right. It's hardly going to save Rishi Sunak's prime ministership.
And in fact, things, I guess, are so bad for the Conservatives that, as one of our columnists wrote the other day, Britain's best hope is a PM with the charisma of frozen peas. And he was, of course, referring there to Labour Party leader Keir Starmer, who's been ahead in the polls, as I think you referred to, for the last 18 months. So that's pretty bad, isn't it?
Yes, and what a lovely turn of phrase our columnist Nick Bryant has to produce that one. So Keir Starmer, Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader.
Excuse me.
All he's had to do, yes, mind your P's and Q's.
That's right.
We'll cancel your appointment at Buckingham Palace.
Yeah.
All he's had to do is look responsible, sensible, and stay calm for the vote to flock to him after all of those Tory disasters. The grandest of which, and the most historically memorable, is Brexit. The Tory parties called a referendum on Brexit to neutralise the issue and get rid of it, and instead they ended up championing it, and Boris Johnson introducing it, and it being one of the greatest anticlimaxes of all time, an act of national self-harm, which now most Brits can see was just that. So this was a perverse outcome that they didn't intend, that's done serious harm to the country, and then innumerable lesser scale disasters as well.
And then I love what you wrote, because I love how you bring humor to these topics. You wrote about Sunak, you'd have to wonder whether a bloke who can't organise an umbrella in a rainstorm can be trusted to organise an army of 18-year-olds. So tell me about that. I mean, is this combination of one of Britain's wealthiest people, who obviously had that very dishevelled moment as well, trying to inspire the youth of his nation with military service? Do you think that's just particularly egregious to some?
Well, just in case anybody hasn't seen the footage, Rishi Sunak went out to announce the election date, and he did it standing in front of number 10 Downing Street, in front of a rostrum, which is standard. The missing detail in this picture so far is that there was pelting rain, and he didn't have an umbrella. He was standing in the rain, getting drenched, and he looked ridiculous. So yeah, if a bloke can't organise an umbrella to go and make one of the biggest statements of his career, how can you trust him to draft an army of 18-year-olds? Exactly. It's an invitation to the satirists as well, and I can't remember which one it was who said a bloke who looks like he'd blister just moving the furniture is now trying to rev up the nation's youth to undertake, sort of Tough Mudder military training. Yeah,
that's right. I loved the introduction to the article under that headline was some of his best friends are soldiers.
Yeah, I met one once.
Yeah, that's right. Not to mention the fact that there was the recent announcement that Sunak's combined wealth with his wife is greater than King Charles. So perhaps there's some real dissonance there between what he, experiences in society and what he's asking of the youth of a nation.
I think it's fair to observe from that pitching this idea, he wasn't pitching to his own people.
That's right. Now, Peter, I want to turn now to the actual concept of national compulsory service that Rishi Sunak has proposed. Like you said, the opposing Labour Party has already rejected it as a desperate gimmick, but that's, of course, what opposing parties are there for. So what do you make of this? Because I thought your inquiry into this was fascinating.
Well, thank you. The thing is that national service as a concept, in democracies at least, has been on the wane for years. Some countries abandoned it. Most countries, democracies, have embraced it at some point. But after World War II, many dumped it. Some reintroduced it for the Vietnam War. Australia did. Australia's had national service 4 times in the history of the Commonwealth since Federation, since 1901. And the most recent of those was the Vietnam War. And then that was abolished by the Whitlam government when the Vietnam War was already essentially lost. And it's then, with the end of the Cold War, some of the remaining countries that still enacted national service, they abandoned it too. Well, the world has changed since then. The long peace has ended. The most dramatic event, of course, being Vladimir Putin's assault on Ukraine. And that's really woken up the Europeans and alarmed a lot of European governments. So in the last half dozen years, since Putin's 2014 annexation of Crimea, European governments have started introducing or reintroducing national service, and there's been a wave of them. So the countries that have announced that they are reintroducing it or who have already introduced it are France, and this is in the last 6, 7, 8 years, France, Sweden, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Germans are actively considering it at the moment and have said that they'll make some announcement about that imminently. That would be a very big step for Germany, but it's a big step for all these countries. Likewise, in Asia, so some countries have never abandoned it because Singapore and South Korea are the 2 most obvious examples. Democratic states, wealthy countries that feel permanently at risk. Singapore and South Korea have maintained their conscription, national service for their young men. In Europe, almost all of these schemes are for men and women, and the countries that haven't had men doing national service in the past, women rather doing national service in the past, are now expanding it to include women. In Asia, that's not the case. In South Korea and Singapore, it's men. But they've maintained those programs for generations. And now 2 more Asian countries have reintroduced national service just in the last months. One is Taiwan, and the other is Malaysia. They all have a common fear, which is China. But there's in the case of South Korea, they're also particularly, of course, braced for a North Korean active aggression. So that's a fair whack of countries reviving the idea. And I should add, it's not all uniform. Boom, boom. The national service schemes vary enormously. Some of them involve compulsory military training and service for everybody, unless they get special exemptions. Israel is an example. Others are much more relaxed. For example, the Malaysian case that is just being reintroduced now. 18-year-olds, young people finish high school. They only need to do 45 days in a kind of a training camp That's all that's required. And there's everything in between, and many different variations. Some accept other forms of service other than military, so community and civilian service. It's a very wide, and not all of them are compulsory. Some are largely voluntary. So it's a very varied menu from which to choose.
I mean, your column was a real eye-opener for me in this regard. I was quite surprised that you put that around 40% of all nations on earth have some form of national service for young people. I mean, that's massive. And I think even more striking was when you wrote that after 2 centuries of peace in Sweden, that the country's Minister for Civil Defense said, have you considered whether you have time to join a voluntary defense organization? If not, get moving. That to me is quite a testament, I guess, to the changing perception of fear or the need for this sort of service.
Yes, and obviously they're deeply concerned about Russia and Putin, and they've joined NATO as well just recently, which is, again, a transformation for Sweden. Finland has done the same. The Finns have long maintained national service, by the way. They've been very serious about it, and now they've applied and succeeded in joining NATO as well. So all the countries that are bordering or close to bordering Russia either have national service or they've reintroduced it. So yes, everybody's feeling very exposed in Europe. And as you say, about 40%, there's about nearly 80 countries in the world have national service. And that number seems to be going up, every year.
But interestingly enough, the I guess momentum for growth of these national compulsory services, they don't necessarily just seem to be about defense, are they? Because I know Rishi Sunak, as you've written, has said that he wants to bring it back to create a renewed sense of pride in our country. So is that a far-fetched idea? I mean, is there anything to suggest that it could accomplish that particular type of goal?
A lot of countries do see value in running these schemes as a way of requiring a contribution to civil society, requiring a contribution to the nation from young people. They see it as an opportunity for their young people to acquire skills, to acquire basic disciplines like getting up early, making the bed, and getting out to do something in the morning.
All the parents are like listening with glee and rubbing their hands together.
Yeah, that's probably right. So they have those concepts of, I suppose, of forming habits and building some sort of rigor into the basic lives of their young people. But this is particularly, I think, interesting, Samantha. There's a fair bit of research been done around the world into these schemes. There are many, and they've been around a long time. And one that I cited in the column was a multi-country study that found that countries that had a national service obligation on their young people, where they had both a military but also a civil option, so you didn't have to do the military part, you could choose a community service, that in general, if you looked at a range of these countries over time, it did create first a fall in the level, a measurable fall in the level of burglary, theft and financial crime in a country, because these schemes apparently equip people with better skills for getting a job, for employment. But also it did appear to create more social bonding. Young people felt less isolated, less adrift, I suppose, and were feeling more close to other young people in their country, feeling more a part of something larger and feeling a part of a national enterprise. So it's Sunak's idea. I mean, it's obviously never going to happen under Sunak because he'll be gone.
Yeah.
And he may just end up having discredited the idea in Britain for the next few years. But the concept that these schemes can add something to social capital, if you like, and to national esprit de corps does appear to be a real one and does appear to be supported by the evidence.
I mean, it begs.
And look, and it's going to add certainly the countries where they've had it, and democracies where we see the evidence, or we can talk to people about it. Singapore, they think it's a fantastic success. The Israelis think it's a fantastic success. 90% of the people who work in the Israeli high-tech sector, which is famous for its success and profitability and innovation in such a small country. 90% of the people who work in that sector have come out of the military service system in Israel. It's become an attractive recruiting ground for Israeli companies and entrepreneurs. They look for people who've had the military service because they think it makes them better employees. So there is plenty of evidence that these schemes have an advantage other than military preparedness and training people for potential war.
I mean, it begs the question whether it would be reintroduced here for those purposes. I mean, as you've written, it was abolished here for the last time in 1972. Do you think that Australian officials might be looking at all of this, looking at your column and thinking, got a lot of depressed youngsters, on social media and, feeling perhaps a lack of social cohesion and all of the things that that the evidence suggests this might help address?
Well, the first thing to say is that nobody's proposing it in Australia at the moment. Labor and Liberal have both said if we were to do such a thing, we would put it to a national referendum first. So rest easy, everybody. It's not happening. However, when you read the National Defence Strategic Review from last year, it talks about requiring Australia to have a total change of mindset about national defence, that Australia is facing a grave risk and let's not shilly-shally, they're talking about China, the risk of Chinese acts of aggression in our region, not necessarily against our continent, but attempts to coerce us through shipping lines, through other means. I mean, they've had a good old crack at it with $20 billion worth of trade bans and a political ban on Australia, which failed and has now been retracted. But we've now seen a awakening of Chinese military harassment of the Australian military policing or travelling or patrolling in international waters, for which our Chinese friends have been completely unapologetic and blamed the Australian side. So this is just a gentle reminder that this is a reality. It's not just some fantasy dreamed up in a back room by some couple of defence nuts writing the Defence Strategic Review. And it talked about the need for a whole of government approach to national defence and, more tellingly, a whole of nation approach. Now, that implies co-opting or cooperating with the private sector, private companies being required to cooperate with government and the Defence Department and other parts of government, Home Affairs for cybersecurity and all the rest. Also implies, if you're talking whole of nation, you're also going to talk about enlisting people outside the military, the professional military. So although nobody's promising it, it's clearly in the ether, if I could put it that way, that one day, if the risk becomes bad enough, it will come up. And there's a professor at the ANU called John Blaxland who has written extensively on how Australia could and should do it anyway, even if the risk to Australia doesn't escalate. John Blaxland has said Australia should have a voluntary and paid national service system. So there's two big qualifiers there, two big conditions. It's voluntary and it's paid, available to all young people coming out of school because of the benefits it would bring, and that it would be available to back up the actual military and the Army Reserve and all the rest of it. But within the Defence Strategic Review, there was a further iteration, a further development of this concept, which was Australia puts too much strain on its current troops to do civilian work. So disaster relief, they're shoveling mud after floods, they're putting out bushfires, or pandemic management. They're standing in stairwells of pandemic hotels. They're in aged care homes manning the laundries because the nursing homes are short of staff because of the pandemic. We call on the military to do all of these things, and it detracts from their day job and their main mission. So the Defence Strategic Review said Australia needs a separate agency specifically to deal with emergencies and with environmental disaster, which makes sense because we know that they're getting more intense and more frequent with climate change. We've yet to see the government act on that, but they like the idea.
And just to wrap up, Peter, you had a really interesting quote from Britain's Chief of General Staff saying that, as Ukraine illustrates, regular armies start wars citizen armies win them. That was really eye-opening for me. So is that really true?
Yeah, well, we're in the process of finding out in the case of Ukraine. But it is true that it was a regular army, Putin's, that started the war, that invaded Ukraine. Citizen armies don't want to start wars. Citizens are citizens and civilians, and we like our lives. We don't go looking for opportunities to risk our lives and kill our fellow humans. Professional armies do it because they're ordered to. And in the case of Ukraine, the Ukrainians, of course, and maybe I should have added them to the list earlier of countries that have reintroduced national service in great haste, only did it after they were invaded because they didn't believe it was going to happen. They were simply in denial. Even the day before Putin's invasion, you had top members of the Ukrainian government saying, no, we don't take this seriously. And then the cruise missiles started slamming into Kyiv. And it was the upsurge in patriotism and a really impressive surge of national spirit. We saw huge numbers of Ukrainian men and women joining their services, and the fighting spirit and the resilience of the Ukrainians against a much, much bigger and better equipped Russian military has been an inspiration. And it does show that when you talk about hard power or soft power and more recent iterations, things like sharp power, academics keep coming up with all these definitions of power, we've been overlooking one really important thing in national defense. That's willpower. And that's what the Ukrainians have demonstrated. And that comes from a civilian army, a citizenry, a population that feels powerfully about defending their country and protecting their homeland.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your time.
Pleasure, Samantha.